Breaking news this Tuesday, December 16th, 2025. After days of some very high-stakes closed-door talks in Berlin, we finally have confirmation.
We do.
The finalized Western-backed peace framework, the one intended to end the war in Ukraine, is apparently ready.
And this is a monumental diplomatic push.
Yeah. But it immediately brings up the biggest question, the one that's been hanging over this entire conflict. Can Ukraine ever get security guarantees that are truly Article 5-like without sacrificing its own fundamental sovereignty?
And that tension right there, security versus sovereignty, that's what this is all about.
I'm Alex.
And I'm Aria.
Join us for the latest Deep Dive by Defense Report for a sharp, no-nonsense breakdown of the latest in global defense news, military technology, and strategic development.
Today, we are diving deep into this 28-point U.S. and European peace framework proposal. It's a document that, well, it's already being criticized by some analysts as a flawed path to peace.
Right.
And it might be less about ending the war tomorrow and more about trying to reorder the entire global security landscape. I mean, it's a huge undertaking.
And our mission for you, the listener, is to unpack the most contested parts of this framework. We're talking about the non-negotiable red lines for both Kyiv and Moscow.
And we're going to reveal why this whole diplomatic push might actually be designed to fail.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We'll explain the specific, very painful concessions Ukraine is being pressured to make right now in exchange for security promises that Russia has already, publicly rejected as an unacceptable threat.
It's a classic diplomatic high-wire act.
And the stakes could not be higher. Subscribe to Defense Reports, your go-to source for timely, in-depth military and defense reports.
Okay, so let's start with the high-stakes context. How did we even get here?
Well, this whole thing really exploded into public view with a recently leaked U.S. proposal, a 28-point plan that started making the rounds in various capitals just earlier this month.
And that first draft was not well received. Not at all.
Yeah.
That original draft, which was reportedly developed with some initial Russian input, was politically explosive. It was immediately seen by a lot of critics as basically a demand for capitulation.
Why so harsh?
Because the terms dictated serious limits on Ukraine's sovereignty. I mean, it proposed forcing Kyiv to cede territory that Russia had largely failed to even capture on the battlefield. It was dictating terms from afar.
So Kyiv's response must have been pretty strong.
It was a swift and firm diplomatic counterpunch. They flat out refused those maximalist terms and came back with their own set of principles, their own red lines.
And that's what led to the Berlin talks.
Exactly. That resistance forced these recent high-level talks in Berlin with key U.S. and European envoys, people like Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner.
And U.S. officials are framing the outcome as a breakthrough.
They are. They're claiming consensus was reached on 90% of the problematic issues. But here's the critical distinction you have to keep in mind.
What's that?
This was a unified Western position. Consensus between Kyiv, the U.S., and Europe. It was not a consensus with Moscow.
Right. That's a huge difference.
It is. President Zelensky's assessment of the new draft was very telling. He called it not perfect, which, speaks volumes about the bitter pills involved.
But he also called it very workable.
Very workable, exactly. And what's driving this relentless pace is some significant external pressure. The timeline is being pushed by an explicit warning from the U.S.
A warning?
Yes. Officials cautioned Ukraine that the security guarantees on offer will not be on the table forever.
That's intense.
It's textbook coercive diplomacy. It forces Ukraine into this profound existential dilemma. Zelensky himself framed it as a choice between the loss of our dignity or the risk of losing a key partner.
Wow.
They're being forced to make these incredibly difficult decisions on territory in exchange for long-term protection. It's a terrible trade-off, but the threat of a weakening Western alliance is, well, it's a powerful motivator.
Meanwhile, what's the view from Moscow?
Russia's just digging its heels in. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov insists Russia wants a comprehensive peace deal, not some temporary truce.
And their argument is?
Their argument is that any truce just gives Ukraine time to rearm, retool, and get ready for the next round. For them, this is a zero-sum foundational conflict.
Okay, so given Russia's history of, breaking promises, we just had to look at the Budapest Memorandum.
A perfect example.
Why are these new guarantees so essential, and what makes this Western proposal strong enough to be called Article 5-like?
This is really the heart of the entire Western effort, creating durable, institutionalized deterrence that can't just be revoked on a whim. This new security proposal has three core components designed to prevent this war from ever starting again.
All right, let's break down the architecture. Component one is the legal side.
Yes.
Zelensky insisted these guarantees can't just look like NATO's Article 5, they had to be legally binding. So what's the mechanism for that?
It has to be voted on and approved by the U.S. Congress. That congressional mandate is absolutely key.
Why is that so much stronger than, say, an executive agreement?
Because an executive agreement can be abandoned by the next administration, legally and easily. If this is passed by Congress, it becomes a statutory obligation. You need another act of Congress to overturn it, which is a much, much higher political hurdle.
Okay, that makes sense. So component two is the military baseline.
The sheer size of it. The plan calls for sustained Western support to keep a powerful Ukrainian army. And the European counterproposal actually revised the initial U.S. limit up to a peacetime strength of 800,000 personnel.
Wait, 800,000. Let's just pause on that number for a second.
It's staggering.
That is nearly double the size of France's entire military. This isn't just a big army. This is a permanent industrial-scale military force.
And the question becomes, how do you sustain that? The training, the equipment, the funding for a standing army of that size, even with Western help. I mean, this isn't just a deterrent. It's an economic behemoth that changes the whole geopolitical calculus in Eastern Europe.
Which brings us to component three, the enforcement mechanisms, a sort of two-part tripwire on the ground.
Right.
The first part is a European-led force, the Multinational and Multi-Domain Force, or MMBF.
Yes, the MMDF. You should think of this as like NATO-light rapid deployment units just for Ukraine.
So troops from a coalition of the willing?
Meaning not all of NATO, but the countries willing to step up. They would be deployed to strengthen those troops and to secure Ukraine from the land, sea, and air. And here's the crucial part.
Go on.
It includes the explicit possibility of these forces operating inside Ukraine.
That's a fundamental change. A shocking shift, really, from everything we've seen before.
It creates a physical tripwire. An attack on Ukraine becomes a direct attack on European forces.
And the second part of that tripwire?
That's a U.S.-led monitoring system, the Ceasefire Monitoring and Verification Mechanism, or CMVM. It would have international personnel on the ground to identify violations and give early warning of any future attack.
So it shifts that responsibility for early warning directly to the West.
It does, but here's the structural vulnerability, the thing Moscow is going to examine with a microscope, looking for any weakness.
What's the loophole?
If this commitment to mirror Article 5 is just a statutory agreement and not a formal treaty, which in the U.S. requires a two-thirds Senate majority for ratification, it is legally vulnerable down the road.
And a two-thirds majority in the Senate is, well, it's incredibly rare for anything. So what's the real-world risk if they don't get that treaty status?
If that guarantee isn't legally immutable, Russia could exploit that. They will calculate that they can just wait it out, that Western political winds will eventually change, allowing them to weaken the protection without ever having to technically break a treaty. The difference between a statute and a treaty could be the difference between durable peace and just, temporary stability.
That's a powerful shield, both military and legal, but it still doesn't solve the biggest problem, does it? The territorial impasse.
Not at all. The fate of the occupied land is still the major unresolved flaw in this whole framework.
Kyiv's position on this has been pretty clear.
Absolutely. They have held a firm, uncompromising red line. President Zelensky completely rules out recognizing Moscow's control over any part of the Donbas, and crucially demands accountability. For Kyiv, you can't separate security from justice.
So to try and break this deadlock, the U.S. proposed a very complex compromise, the Free Economic Zone, or FEZ. How is that supposed to work?
Well, the basic idea is that Ukraine would pull its forces back from the parts of Donetsk Oblast they still control. We're talking about roughly 2,500 square miles.
And in return?
In return, that newly vacated area becomes this free economic zone. The key point, as Kyiv stresses, is that this zone should not mean under the control of the Russian Federation. It's supposed to be demilitarized, but open for economic rebuilding, funded by the West.
But the language here seems tricky. The terminology immediately conflicts with what Moscow wants.
That's exactly where the danger lies. Russia isn't calling it a beneficial FEZ. They're calling it a demilitarized zone, a DMZ.
The completely different framing.
Completely. The Russian term prioritizes military separation, freezing the conflict. It's not about economic opportunity. So critics are warning that this nice-sounding language, free economic zone, is really just masking a unilateral Ukrainian military retreat from strategic ground.
With no reciprocal move from Russia.
Exactly. And Kyiv has raised some critical security questions about this, which seem completely justified.
Like what?
Well, they immediately question the asymmetry. If Ukraine withdraws, why doesn't Russia withdraw the same distance? How do you prevent Russian forces from just re-entering the zone, especially if Moscow considers it part of its own annexed territory?
Right.
The concern is that Ukraine is trading tangible strategic ground today for a vague economic promise and the risk of a frozen conflict that really favors Russia.
And to really appreciate this compromise, it's worth remembering how far we've come from that first draft.
Oh, yes. The original maximalist U.S. draft was truly stark. It was pushing for international recognition of Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk as de facto Russian territory. It would have forced a Ukrainian withdrawal, where that zone would then be internationally recognized as territory belonging to the Russian Federation.
So the current FEZ proposal, as flawed as it is a real testament to Kyiv's successful diplomatic pushback.
Without a doubt.
So even with this unprecedented security package on the table, the whole thing still has to survive Russian rejection. And we have Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov's red lines from December 11th.
And they detail a massive, almost unbridgeable gap between this framework and what Moscow actually wants.
What are the key points?
Lavrov basically rejected 7 key elements of the last plan, making it clear Russia's goals are still zero-sum. First, Russia rejects confirming Ukraine's sovereignty unless it's permanently conditional.
Conditional on what?
On Ukraine returning to a non-aligned, neutral, and non-nuclear status. Permanently.
So their position isn't just we want a neutral Ukraine. It's that Ukraine's very existence as a sovereign state has to be forever subservient to Russian security interests.
Precisely. Which fundamentally rejects the entire point of the Western effort to give Ukraine robust, institutionalized security.
What about NATO?
Their demands there are even more extreme. Russia is demanding a full rollback of NATO forces to their pre-1997 borders.
So this isn't just about preventing new members.
No, this is a direct challenge to the sovereign decisions of Poland, Romania, the Baltic states, all full NATO members. This would, for example, prevent stationing European fighter jets in Poland, which was something mentioned in the U.S. draft.
And Lavrov even threatened any peacekeepers, like the proposed MMDF.
He did. He said any such forces operating in Ukraine would be deemed legitimate military targets. So he implicitly rejected the whole concept of reliable security guarantees.
And on territory, they still want more.
Much more. Their ultimatum requires a complete Ukrainian withdrawal from all unoccupied parts of the 4 annexed regions, so Kherson and Zaporizhia too, not just freezing the current line.
They're demanding a military victory through diplomatic pressure.
That's what it is. The contradiction between the Western deterrence package and these Russian demands is, well, it's absolute.
So if you put all this together, the gap between Western deterrence, the MMDF, the 800,000-strong army, and Russian demands is just irreconcilable.
And that's why the real strategic function of this final plan is likely a kind of diplomatic forcing function.
What do I mean by that?
It forces Putin's hand. He has to either engage constructively with this unified Western front, or he has to reject it completely, which makes it clear to everyone that the diplomatic path is closed. The process itself has served to rally Kyiv and its partners to clarify their resolve, even if it hasn't solved the core conflict.
And the consequences of that rejection are already built in.
Yes. Zelensky has publicly warned that if Putin rejects the framework, Ukraine expects immediate increased Western pressure, tougher sanctions, and critically, the immediate delivery of better military support.
Things like advanced air defense and long-range weapons.
Exactly. So the ultimate measure of this so-called peace framework might not be whether it actually achieves peace,
But whether its predicted failure triggers the necessary pre-approved escalation of Western military support that Ukraine needs to turn the tide on the battlefield.
that could be the real endgame here.
Okay, let's zoom back out and try to wrap this up. We have this unprecedented security package backed by the U.S. Congress with the possibility of European boots on the ground.
Matched against a very painful territorial compromise, the FEZ, that requires a unilateral Ukrainian withdrawal from vital strategic ground.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener?
I think the whole diplomatic exercise has clarified 2 main things. First, Kyiv and the West are unified on deterrence and security. But second, they're still worlds apart from Moscow on territory and on the perpetual nature of Ukrainian sovereignty.
And those 2 issues remain the core structural conflicts?
They do. But there's one last element that, if it's ignored, I think it fundamentally undermines any claim that this could be a just or durable peace.
And what is that?
The European counterproposal specifically suggested deleting a provision that offers full amnesty for all actions during the war.
And instead?
Instead, they put in language saying that provision will be made to address the suffering of victims, asserting that crimes against humanity fall under universal jurisdiction.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought.
Can a durable peace ever be built on a foundation that ignores accountability for war crimes and crimes against humanity? The question we have to mull over is whether ignoring that deep-seated need for justice today will simply plant the seeds for the next war tomorrow.
Something for you to explore on your own. You've been listening to Defense Report by Alex and Arya, where we analyze the latest in military strategy, global defense, and advanced weaponry. Subscribe to Defense Reports, your go-to source for timely, in-depth military and defense reports. We'll catch you next time.